Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine, and I am here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about purpose statements. Now, if you are joining us and you are in the education doctorate program, know that we do have a specifically targeted webinar for writing an EDD dissertation purpose statement. It is related to what we are going to be looking at today, but not quite the same because in that case, you are designing a larger scope of study, and of course your purpose statement and the rest of the materials will probably be larger in scope and more in depth to go with that. So if you happen to be in that category or pointing yourself that way, we're certainly happy to have you, but I will say that we have a full 1 hour webinar on that topic that's already recorded and on the website. Today we're going to be delving into a specific assignment. Now, as we embark on things, because this is new, relatively early in the service, we have a variety of offerings available that you may be interested in. First, we have a whole larger series of webinars that we offer like this. They're all free. We record them all and post them to our website. So even if you are unable to make the webinar live in person, you can always view the recording online. And if you RSVP for a webinar, we will add you to a list of people who get a copy of the recordings for that webinar. So you do not need to attend the whole time. You don't need to show up at all. We will still send you a recording. So we have some people who sign up just for that, even though they have class or work or something like that during the same time window. We work with students also through one-on-one appointments. These come in two flavors. There are asynchronous appointments, and there are real-time appointments that we do on phone and Zoom. Asynchronous appointments, you schedule a block in our WC Online system. By the time that appointment comes around, you upload a copy of your paper, and we will send you feedback within 24 hours of your appointment. You can include specific questions that you have. You can include concerns. Some people even include feedback from faculty and say, hey, I'm trying to answer this. Does it look like I've done that? Or I'm not sure what they're saying. Can you help me understand this? And that's totally fine. Whatever requests you want, put them in there. If not, we'll just give it a general look at and give you feedback based on what we see. We are also available for real-time appointments via phone or Zoom. This usually comes up if someone has some questions that they just feel like they want to have a flowing conversation and not necessarily something where you write a whole list out at once. And also, if there's something that you want to see, some people are having trouble using Word or with our APA course paper template, and that's totally fine. To make an appointment for one of those, just send us a request to onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. It helps if you give us a couple times so that we can match you up with people, but that's totally fine. The only thing I'll say there is that in week 7, we are usually 100% booked with asynchronous appointments. So if you have a question like that, try and catch us week 0 through week 6. Week 7 is just super busy. And we also have various resources, sample papers, templates, posts on specific topics on the Online Writing Center website. The general workflow for making an appointment with us is, again, you go ahead and schedule an appointment on WC Online. By the time that comes around, that appointment slot comes around, you go to the Writing Center site in Canvas and find the link to upload your paper for that appointment. If you're done with your paper early, great, just send it up early and we'll get to it. And that's it. We'll send you feedback via email in 24 hours. You may be interested in some of the webinars we have coming up. We have, right after this, Writing as a Nurse, Annotated Bibliographies and Synthesis. So if you have an annotated bibliography assignment that's coming up for you, you might be interested in sticking around for that because the general principles apply whether you are in that particular nursing class or if you're taking any other class where you're writing an annotated bibliography. We also have a number of other things, including a relatively new offering that we have, the undergraduate student drop-in. You just show up with your questions and things you want comments on, and we talk through it, kind of like office hours or dropping in at our desk in the library, and a whole slew of other topics. Some resources you'll hear me referring to. There is an APA course paper template that I developed. You can download that from the Writing Center website or just send us an email and we'll send it back to you. We have a YouTube channel, so in case you are wanting to watch one of our webinars on the go, that's a convenient way to find everything. And we have a blog. All right, this is a focused webinar, which means we're really zeroing in on one assignment. We probably won't take the whole hour, but I invite you to ask questions as we go along, because really the purpose of this is to delve into this one topic and give students such as yourself a little bit of extra insight, a way of bouncing off questions, and to help you really dive in and write this assignment from a place of confidence that you understand it and know what you need to do to get full credit, and also produce a project that is of reasonable scope. All right, so we are going to be looking at MFTO 615's purpose statement assignment. And before we delve into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where things often go wrong with this sort of assignment. One very common area is when people mix up writing a problem statement and writing a purpose statement. And this happens all the time. I've taught at several universities now, and I guarantee every term there'll be a couple of students who come in and say, I don't understand why I lost points on this. And I'll look at this and say, well, you're talking about the general problem that inspired the study. That really goes in the problem statements section, because the purpose statement is where you describe what you either did if your work is done, what you will do if you haven't yet done your study or your investigation or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So the problem statement area is where you define the general problem that you're chipping away at, and the specific problem, which is the subset of that that you decided you're going to be addressing. For example, if you were addressing poverty in the United States, poverty is a big thing. It has lots of factors in it. It is a problem in every one of the 50 US states and all the territories. It's a big thing. It's not exactly the kind of thing that you'd expect to solve in one project or one study, no matter how well resourced. But there is some subset of that. You might say, okay, so we're looking at poverty within this particular neighborhood, where we can go through and say, all right, we have X number of families. We're going to see what we can do to make a difference in their life. That's the difference between the general and specific problems. General one is there's poverty in the United States. The specific one is, oh, there's poverty in this community, and now we can look at what will work in this community. And the purpose statement in an example like that, the purpose would be something like, oh, we are trying to lift at least 25% of the families that meet the federal definition of being below the poverty line. We're trying to lift them above the poverty line in X period of time using these methods. That's the purpose. Now, you really want to make sure that you don't get off track there, because it's usually people pick a problem that they're passionate about. And so when they're writing about the purpose statement, they've got a lot that they could say about that problem, but make sure that the purpose statement stays focused on what you are doing and why you're doing that, not explaining why you're interested in the topic or why there is the problem. So it's not about whether a problem exists. It's about explaining why you think this specific study, the things that you're proposing to do, will be helpful and justified, etc. Now, at this point, I would like to ask if you might tell me a little bit about what interests you. You're presumably in the MFTO program because there are doors you want the degree to open for you. So if you might tell me about a problem or issue that interests you, it may be one that you're planning on studying. It may be something that you've noticed in the community around you or in one that you're close to. If you let me know what a problem that interests you, I can use that as an example for this next section. And if it's not something that you feel comfortable sharing publicly in the chat, that's fine. In the chat, you can also send me a private message, and then only I will see it. All right, so we're going to zero in on the MFTO 615 class. This is research methods in family therapy. And we're going to look at two interrelated things. One of them you should have already done. That was last week's discussion, the purpose statements discussion. And that leads into today's main focus, which is the week 2 assignment on purpose statements. Now, that discussion, just to remind you, was asking, what do you think researchers struggle with the most when trying to write a purpose statement, and why? And one of the reasons I think this is helpful to revisit is it's a good way of thinking about, okay, so what are the actual questions that you are asking yourself in designing your purpose statement, in deciding what are you actually planning on doing in your project? Now, the actual assignment instructions are fairly short here. Just review these things from Creswell's research design book and write a maximum one-page purpose statement for your research proposal following APA style. That's pretty straightforward. And if we look at the rubric, we see that this is basically reiterating all those things. And we see about a third of the points going to staying within the length and having it be formatted and proofread and such. And 2/3 of the points are just about that purpose statement. Now, usually when I talk with a student who hasn't written a purpose statement before, they have one of two things to say here. One of them is, okay, a page is really a long time, a lot of space to write about this. Or they say, oh, one page is not long enough. And usually if it's not long enough, it's because they're including stuff that should be in the problem statement part of your paper, of your proposal, the larger proposal, not the assignment today. And usually if they're thinking it's very long, they're thinking they have to have this big elaborate purpose statement like they've read in an article. And I'd say, a purpose statement for an MFTO project is usually around a paragraph, half a page or so. Can it be longer? Can it be 2 paragraphs? Sure. But not every project will have that in-depth a thing. How many variables are you dealing with? How much of the context you need to explain for your reader to understand what you're proposing? That will vary. Now, as a reminder, I've pasted here a couple pages from the Creswell book, from the chapter that the identified reading is coming from. And let's just remind ourselves about some of the text here. I am reading from that introductory paragraph. The last section of an introduction is to present a purpose statement that establishes the intent of the entire research study. It is the most important statement in the entire study, and it needs to be clear, specific, and informative. From it, all other aspects of the research follow, and readers will be lost unless it is carefully drafted. In journal articles, researchers write the purpose statement into introductions as the final statement. In theses and dissertations, it often stands as a separate section. If you were to go to the ACU database of electronic theses and dissertations, you would find that what Creswell said is broadly true. We require students to have their purpose statement in a separate section. And this is both because it makes it easy to find, and also because it makes it easy to write, because you look at the heading and say, oh, well, anything that doesn't really fall into that heading should just be in a different section. All right, continuing here. The purpose statement indicates why you want to do the study and what you intend to accomplish. The passage is called the purpose statement because it conveys the overall intent of a proposed study in a sentence or several sentences. Note that Creswell does not say several pages, so this should be reasonably concise. Often it fits in one paragraph. Occasionally 2 is helpful if you've got a lot of stuff that you want to explain, but even then you're probably giving a good gist of it in one paragraph, and then you follow up with additional detail. And I'd like to then call your attention to the second page that you see here. This is the first bulleted paragraph where it has a very helpful suggestion. Use words such as purpose, intent, or objective to signal attention to this statement as a central controlling idea. Set it off as a separate sentence or paragraph and use the language of research such as, the purpose of the study is blah. And later on in this textbook, they include various formulas that you're instructed to use. Remember, it says review the scripts. And so these provide models that you can use when you are writing your own purpose statement. All right. The second bullet conveys something that's very important, to focus on a single phenomenon. This is that distinction we were talking about between a general problem and a specific problem. You want the purpose of your study to be to address that specific problem. And so that's probably going to mean you're only going to be studying a small number of things this time around. You can always have follow-up research. You can always do another project. I have a couple friends who did their master's. They expanded on their master's research in their doctorate, and now they've been professors for several years, and they're still researching on expanding the same thing. And that's totally okay. You don't have to solve all the problems in the world in this one study. In fact, I'd be surprised if you did. All right, one last page that I wanted to look at before we move on. So the second item here says, provide a general working definition. This is basically a setting out what you're going to be doing. So if you say, well, I'm going to study happiness, well, tell us how you're going to study happiness. Is there a specific survey that you're going to use? Are you going to interview people and then code their responses? Whatever that happens to be, tell us what that will be. Next one, include words denoting the strategy of inquiry. Okay, yes, tell us how you're going to go about doing this using specific research language. And then the rest of these are going through a set of questions. Essentially, we want to answer those questions: who, what, where, when, how, and why. So if you're looking at this, and I see someone has written in a example of something that interests them, who are you going to study? And they've identified a population of Korean American immigrants. Okay, so that would be the general population. Now, the general population is distinct from the participants, the people who actually provide data for the study, but they're closely related. The participants you will ultimately recruit, and you can write about them later, but right now you're trying to address some issue with the larger population. All right, so that's the who. So what are you going to study? This is going to be the phenomenon. Is this going to be their happiness? Is it how they deal with depression after a divorce? Whatever that should be. All right, now we should talk about boundaries. Boundaries can come in more than one type. You can have physical boundaries, like we're going to a research site or we're doing a certain neighborhood. You can have a kind of associational boundaries, like, oh, we're looking at people in a specific occupation. Or they could be boundaries of time. When are we going to study these people or the phenomenon? Or how long are we going to do that? And then we have the how question of, well, what are we going to be tracking here? If we're looking at, are we trying to get information that converts to numbers? That'd be the quantitative. Well, that's a methodology. Qualitative is when we're dealing with things that don't translate well into numbers. If we're dealing with both of those things, that's a mixed method methodology. Now, for the question, what will you be measuring? That's going to be the dependent variable. That's the thing that we think will change in response to our changing something else. So for going to the previous example of Korean Americans and going through a divorce, well, it would be probably unethical for us to go ahead and, make some of these people marry and get divorced again. That would be hard to get people to sign up. And morally dubious if we were to pay them. But you could have your independent variable to track something like, say, their socioeconomic status, or whether or not they came to therapy, or how long they came to therapy. And so this is the thing that is changing, and that we're then seeing, okay, if this changes, do we see any patterns in these other things that we're measuring, the dependent variables? And if we see a pattern there, then you can do statistical analysis and other things like that to see, is it a meaningful pattern, or does it seem to be a meaningful pattern? Now, not every independent and dependent variable will have something that responds to that kind of analysis, but you get the idea. All right, so here's an example of one of those scripts that's presented in the Creswell text. The purpose of this thing is to test this other thing and determine if this thing is happening. Now, there's some things that you may or may not have here, like control variables. Control variable is when you try and create patterns in the data by saying, okay, here's a group of people who aren't being affected. Here we have Korean Americans of the approximately the same age and living in the same place who didn't get divorced. What's their happiness like? Are they going to therapy? And that allows you to compare things, because you have the control that doesn't have the thing you think is having an effect, and the people who are potentially affected by that. You'll notice it also identifies as, okay, who are your participants at the research site? Okay, great. The independent variables, what you're tracking, and what you think is, what you know will be changed in some way, married or unmarried, divorced, not divorced, perhaps. Dependent variables, what you think is being influenced that you're also measuring, like their happiness, and any other factors. All right. As I said earlier, this is a streamlined one, so let's just dive in and look at some things. So Creswell includes a couple sample statements. This one is, Karloff 2000 conducted a 2-year longitudinal study of 54 college women about their attitudes and experiences with sexual victimization. These women responded to 2 identical male surveys administered 2 years apart. So we've got a couple things here. So what are they doing? Oh, a 2-year longitudinal study. Longitudinal means over an extended period of time, where the idea is you're trying to compare what has changed in this period of time. Longitudinal studies are usually, the bare minimum is considered a month. People tend to prefer at least 6 months. So 2 years is pretty good. Probably the most famous is well-conducted longitudinal study is called the Framingham Heart Study. And this is so well known that when I was growing up in the Boston area, people knew about it, that this is a study where they went and they tracked people so well over multiple decades that they even kept track of your friends and family, so that in case they lost track of you, they could get back in touch. They did pay people to participate in the study, incidentally. And because they were tracking so much information, people keep going back to the data and finding new patterns. For example, someone analyzing data from the Framingham Heart Study noticed that people tended to quit smoking in groups. And if you had one person who quit while all their friends were still smoking, they'd probably start smoking again. And that's the kind of thing that you really only notice when you're looking at things over a long period of time, which is why longitudinal is very nice when you have the resources to do it. Do I recommend doing a longitudinal study for a master's thesis? Probably not. Do I recommend doing it for a doctoral dissertation? Again, my question is, can you address this problem? Can you have a productive purpose now that will give you the results you need without going to that trouble at this point? Because you can always do a follow-up study, but longitudinal studies tend to take a lot of resources to keep track of people, and so it tends to be done with well-funded grants. Okay, so breaking this down some more. Where is this being done? Okay, college women, so people who are attending college, who, since this is retrospective, since they did the work, they're telling us, well, they used 54 college women. If they were writing a proposal, it probably read something like, okay, we're going to do a study of several dozen college women and in this area or at this campus. Okay, so what's being tracked? Attitudes and experiences with sexual victimization. These women responded to two identical male surveys administered 2 years apart. So if you're having trouble identifying what's the independent variable, I would say ask yourself the question, what would you as the researcher be changing? In this case, the researchers are administering the same identical survey, but they're doing it 2 years apart. So what they're doing is they're changing the time that they're asking. Hence, that's the independent variable. Now, what they think will change are the participants' attitudes and experiences. So that's the dependent variable that they think is going to be affected by the independent variable of when they're asking, at the start of the study or 2 years later. So, hope that clarifies things a little bit. Let's look at another one. All right. We designed the present study to compare the responses of Navy recruits on the IM and SD scales collected under 3 conditions. Now, you might already be thinking here, oh, I think the condition is the independent variable, and that's a good instinct. With paper and pencil, on a computer with backtracking allowed, and a computer with no backtracking allowed. Backtracking would be like I'm able to go back and edit paragraph 1 without having to delete everything. Approximately half of the recruits answered the questionnaire anonymously, and the other half identified themselves. So now we have another thing that is changing. And one of those questions is, do we have more than one independent variable here? Or do we have a control? And that's probably going to depend on whether this is something that the researchers are selecting or not. If it's just the recruits are choosing to put their name down, that looks like it's an independent variable. If you're just sorting people, okay, you have to write your name, you don't have to, that's more of a control situation. It's still a variable, but it's function that's different. And in this case, what they're looking to see what will change, well, the responses to these 2 survey instruments, the IM and SD scales. All right, so I promised this would be a briefer webinar today. So we're going to just spend another 10 minutes or so, and we're going to look at how to draft a purpose statement. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load up a copy of our AP course template, which again, you can download from the Writing Center website, or if you type your email address in the chat, we'll send you an email. And then we'll get to it. All right, if you look at this, you'll see that I have a blank copy of our APA course paper template. There are a bunch of comments here explaining everything. If you are familiar with the template, you don't want to watch that, that's okay. What you'll do is you can just go to the review tab and select delete all comments, and there they're gone. All right, now this assignment doesn't require an abstract, so we just delete this page. And I'll go ahead and delete the rest of this placeholder text too. All right, now remember, the slides showed us that instruction from Creswell that you should go ahead and use specific language, like the purpose of this study is to. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to make an example here. It's going to be adjacent to marriage and family therapy, but probably not a topic that any of you are going to be discussing. The purpose of the study is to identify effective strategies for reconciling couples who have already filed for divorce in French Polynesia. All right, so what have we laid out here? We've laid out what the goal is. The goal is to find what works to reconcile these couples. Now, if you are thinking about your own MFTO thesis, I would suggest not going in the direction here because, as you can see, it lays out staying married for at least 5 years afterwards. This means that the study is going to need to run for at least 5 years, and that's longer than anyone should spend in a master's program on just their thesis. So now you can change the criteria here. Okay, if we'd say as defined by the couple's withdrawing, they're filing for divorce. Okay, as defined by the couple's withdrawing, you're filing for divorce within 3 months of initiating counseling. Now we have the same basic idea, but we are now measuring on a scale that you could potentially do this in a semester, which is much more reasonable than 5 years. Now, what project interests you, what you're trying to do there, that will, of course, vary. But again, I would stress the importance of having something that is practical. So, what kind of study are we going to do? So, this is where we start being more specific about those questions here. So, we've got the who, that's couples who've already filed for divorce in French Polynesia. We've got the when, the period of time. Okay. We've kind of got the where for French Polynesia. Now, that's a big thing. We might make that more specific, like, let's change French Polynesia here to Tahiti, which is the capital of French Polynesia. So now instead of having to go and fly to all these different islands, we've cut it down geographically to a bounded scope. When the ocean starts, that's out of scope for this. All right, now this could also potentially include couples who've come there for the honeymoon, who hopefully aren't filing for divorce on their honeymoon. But let's make that local couples. So now we specified, all right, we're not trying to deal with all those tourists. We're looking at people who live here. All right. And, let's even go so far as let's make that of Polynesian descent. So we're trying to narrow down the cultural factors here. Now, let's say you wanted to go in a different direction. Let's say you wanted to compare what worked better for couples of different backgrounds. Well, we would go ahead and modify this. The purpose of the study is to identify effective strategies to identify which strategies are most effective for and as a metropolitan in this case means European France. All right, so the second example you see takes a different tactic. The purpose of the study is to identify which strategies are most effective for reconciling local couples, Polynesian descent, and metropolitan French couples living in French Polynesia who have already filed for divorce in Tahiti. So here, the dependent variable is going to be what works, however we're measuring that. And the independent variable is going to be whether they are of local couples of Polynesian descent and whether they're from metropolitan France and living there. So either of these are fine. It's going to be a very different study, but that's not a problem. If we're trying to identify which is most effective, that can be measured a couple different ways. If we're doing a qualitative study, then we're going to probably be asking questions and trying to tease out people's responses and things that don't necessarily uh, lend themselves to a survey. So, uh, so a semi-structured interview, if you're wondering, a structured interview is when you go with a set of questions and you only ask the questions on that list. A lot of job interviews are like that. They just read the questions and then they don't add ones. Semi-structured is when you can use their answers as a starting point for additional questions. So you want people to elaborate, to give more detailed stuff. So a lot of research uses semi-structured interviews because they're interested in being able to follow up and figure out what's going on here. Now, if we're going to do this a different way, then you might have something like this. The purpose of this quantitative study is to identify which strategies. So the same overall goal, but going about it with a quantitative study. So we're going to need to have a different data collection. I'm just making up this survey instrument here. Uh, a pre-post test, that's when you're administering the same thing at the start of something and at the end of something. And so you can see that the intervals are the same, but they're collecting different and information. Sorry, they're collecting the information through different channels. The instrument will have standardized questions, and the people answering them are not going to be departing from them because it's just standardized questions. And so that makes it easy to map the trends there. So you can approach the same topic qualitatively, you can approach it quantitatively. It all depends on what you're trying to do. Now, if we're looking at the first example that we have here, when we're trying to just identify effective strategies for reconciling them, well, that suggests that the goal is to find out what will work with this group. Now, the second one is more saying, okay, well, we know that there are these two very different groups, and we think, for some reason, probably previous research or professional experience, we think that there is some difference here. So we want to go ahead and find out what works best for each group. And then the third one is saying, okay, yes, same thing, but we're going to use this systematic instrument, something that doesn't have the R having a subjective filter as a researcher. We're going to have them fill this out, and it's all going to be numerized so that it's very easy to do statistical analysis and say, okay, well, 56% people said this, 32 said that, the rest said this other thing. So yeah, it all depends on what study you're trying to do and what kind of outcomes you want. If you're going to be training people and say, well, okay, well, 1 in 6 people, this doesn't work for them, so you should try this other thing, the quantitative thing might be the best. If you are not at that point, but you want to ask questions and perhaps create a survey later that will allow you to do the quantitative study, then semi-structured interviews are probably a good place to start. So those are some of the kinds of things that you might be talking about here. Let's go back to these slides for a moment. So this says, okay, a purpose statement related to the research topic. And Creswell says, okay, to establish the intent of the entire research study. So this is one of those things that you tend to add near the end, what this will facilitate. And this is where you might get language such as, hold on. Now, I'm not saying that this will be a goal for your study. This is just an example, but this study is specifically designed to inform the MFTO training of local counselors so that they can provide culturally informed, effective feedback and decrease the large portion of couples divorcing. I don't know that the latter is a goal that you will have, but if that were the case, I'd say, okay, be careful about that, because if it sounds like you're trying to decrease a large proportion of couples divorcing, that's going to be hard to prove. So you'd want to make sure that this is kind of a long-term goal and not something that the study is designed to accomplish. So let's look back at those slides again. Okay, so central phenomenon. Okay, so say divorce. All right, and what's going to take place? All right, well, what are we measuring? What are we trying to track? So sometimes you'll have something that doesn't translate very well to existing terminology. That's fine. If there's not a standard term for it, just tell us what it is. As if you are looking for something to describe your population that we're dealing with, just as you saw in our examples here, you can define that in terms of geography. You could describe that in terms of background. You could even go ahead and say, okay, we're going to compare people who come in on different days. You may have more or less stress with your relationship if you come in on a Monday or a Friday. Frankly, that could go either way. So the more information that you have, the more it'll be clear what you're trying to do. So in the second to last paragraph, the last bullet on this page, you see, okay, the central phenomenon may be limited to individuals and business organizations who participate in creative teams. These delimitations help to further define the parameters of the research study. So this is another thing that you can write about. Delimitations. What's a delimitation? A delimitation is a boundary that you are choosing. A limitation is something that negatively impacts or potentially negatively impacts the generalizability of the study. So a delimitation would be like our saying, okay, we're only going to look at local couples of Polynesian descent. A limitation would be, okay, well, we only looked at local couples of Polynesian descent. We have no idea what's going on with the other couples. So the delimitation, the choice to focus on one, means that it's harder for us to apply our results to the other population and have some confidence that they would work. They could work, we just don't know because we didn't test that. Another example would be if we were going to do a linguistic delimitation and say only get people who are native speakers of a certain language, or if we are looking for people in a particular community. For example, in Los Angeles, there's actually a fairly large Iranian American community. And you could certainly do a study on that community and say, well, there are other people in the neighborhood, but we're really looking at the Iranian Americans. And then we get into questions like, okay, we're going to deal with all Iranian Americans, or people who were born in another country and grew up here, or they came here as children, or second generation ones who were born here and grew up here. Yeah, depending on how you did those delimitations, you could get very different results because there's a lot of intergenerational change, especially in a larger city like Los Angeles. So I hope that was helpful today. We have some time for questions in case you have any. But either way, I hope that you got something out of this, and feel free to visit the Writing Center again. We're going to be switching gears to go into our next webinar momentarily, but feel free to ask questions.